Let's make a start then. Thank you all for coming along to the second installment of our course on the evidences for Christianity. This evening, we are going to be beginning a series of presentations on the reliability of the gospel accounts. We're going to be camping out on the gospels for several weeks, looking at different species of evidence that pertain to the reliability and credibility of the gospels and their anchoring in credible eyewitness testimony. Just to recap, for those of you who weren't here last time, you can find the recording from last week's last time's session on the Discord server. If you want to catch up on last week's session, we covered basically epistemological foundations in each sort of evidence, how to reason about such matters, and so forth. I just want to summarize once again the overview of my argument for Christianity, and then I'll talk about how the evidence that we're going to be presenting this week and in subsequent weeks relates to those arguments for Christianity. So basically, over the next several weeks, I'm going to be arguing that an avalanche of varied cumulative evidence demonstrates that the Gospels and Acts are based on the testimony of credible eyewitnesses, and that they are substantially trustworthy. Now, a common objection, of course, that is often raised when I make such an argument is that demonstration of mundane events in the Gospels doesn't provide support for the supernatural aspects of the text. And it's certainly true that there's no logical progression from a demonstration of the more mundane matters of the Gospels to confirmation of the supernatural aspects of the text, such as the resurrection, for example, or the virgin birth. However, what I would argue is that the demonstration that these accounts are actually grounded in credible eyewitness testimony, that the Gospels are actually composed by individuals who are well-informed, close up to the facts, and habitually scrupulous, provides us with reason to believe that the accounts in the Gospels and Acts concerning the nature and variety of the resurrection encounters with the risen Jesus actually reflects what was being asserted by those who were purportedly eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection. And when we look at the nature of those claims, we find that they are multi-sensory in character, involving multiple sensory modes, not just individual sightings or even group sightings at a distance, but rather group conversations with Jesus, physical contact with Jesus, long discourses with Jesus, like the disciples on the road to Emmaus, for example, eating with Jesus on more than one occasion. In Luke 24, Jesus eats broiled fish in their presence. In John 21, Jesus eats breakfast with the disciples on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and so forth. According to Acts 1, it was extended towards a 40-day time period. So it's a sort of set of testimonial claims it's difficult to be honestly mistaken about. And then when you look at the context of the early testimony of the gospel in the early decades of the church, we find that the early apostles were willing to voluntarily undergo and endure sufferings and labors and dangers and persecutions and hardships on account of their testimony that, in fact, Christ was raised from the dead. And that willingness to suffer and endure persecution goes a long way towards establishing their sincerity in holding to that belief. And so by reducing the plausibility of those two contending explanations for why the apostles claimed what they did, namely that they were honest and mistaken, or that they were setting out to deceive people, that in turn redistributes the probabilities and renders, in my view, the hypothesis that Jesus in fact rose from the dead the most probable or the best explanation of the relevant data. So here's just my 6 lines of argument that I would adduce in favor of Christianity. So number one, you've got the argument for the resurrection, which I just articulated in brief. We'll cover that in a lot more detail in several weeks' time. There's also the trilemma argument, which is based on the argument that the claim that Jesus was divine actually goes back to Jesus himself. Jesus actually asserted his own divine status. And we'll look at the evidence for that in due course. That being the case, you've got 3 possible options: either that he was honestly mistaken about his identity, or he set out to deceive people, or he actually was who he claimed to be. And the fact that he was willing to get himself crucified on account of that testimony is strong evidence that goes a long way towards establishing that he was at least sincere holding that belief And then, of course, he there's a very small reference class of individuals that can be honestly mistaken about being the creator of the universe and the God of Israel incarnate. And Jesus doesn't seem to fit that reference class. And again, we'll talk about this in more detail in due course. There's also the argument for messianic prophecy, which I won't belabor here. And there's also the argument from the conversion of the Apostle Paul, which again, we'll talk about in a lot more detail in a future session. The argument from contemporary miracles has been documented by people like Craig Keener and Robert Lorimer and Lee Strobel and others, which also, and J.P. Moreland, which is also, I think, a fascinating line of evidence for the truth of Christianity. And then finally, there's the survival of the nation of Israel against all odds. Now, it's not necessary, of course, for me to show that each of those arguments individually is sufficient to demonstrate Christian belief or sufficient to justify Christian belief. Rather, it's only important to show that in aggregate, these arguments are cumulatively sufficient to justify Christian belief. And we talked a little bit about the nature of cumulative cases and evidence last session. Okay, so in tonight's session, we're going to be covering a particular species of internal evidence for the reliability of the Gospels. There are basically two broad categories of evidence for the reliability of the Gospels. You've got internal evidence and you've got external evidence. And then these can, of course, be broken down into multiple subcategories as well. Now, of course, a common objection that rears its head from time to time when this gets brought up is, well, surely this is circular reasoning. You cannot use the Bible to prove the Bible. And of course, this is certainly true if by using the Bible to prove the Bible, you mean to say that the Bible is true because it asserts itself to be true. Of course, that is begging the question, that is circular. But that's not really what we're doing here tonight. What we're doing is we're treating the Bible as a set of testimonies. Of course, it would make no sense in the legal setting to say that you can't use a witness's testimony as evidence for what the witness is attesting without reasoning in a circle. Of course you can. This is what happens in forensic statement analysis, for example. So it's perfectly legitimate to use the sources of those who are bearing testimony concerning an event that they are purportedly a witness to. Now, what are the categories of evidence that I would adduce in support of the strong and robust reliability of the New Testament accounts? Well, here are a number of different categories. So undesigned coincidences, and I'll talk about what these are in due course, extra biblical confirmations, difficult local knowledge, expressive silence, artless similarities, unexplained allusions, the criterion of embarrassment, the principle of restraint, and reconcilable variations, okay? And this evening, we're only going to be focusing on one species of evidence for the reliability of the New Testament, and in particular, the Gospels. We're not going to be touching on Acts this evening, though we will come to Acts in due course. But tonight, we are going to be looking at undesigned coincidences, specifically in the Gospel accounts. So what is an undesigned coincidence? Well, sometimes two works by different authors interlock in a way that would be very unlikely if one of them were copied from the other, or both were copied from a common source. So, for example, one book may mention in passing a detail that answers some question raised by the other. The two records fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Now, so imagine, this is giving an example to illustrate, imagine that you're inventing a gospel story, and the setup for the miracle story is going to have to do with money and food. Now, which disciple might you pick? Well, you might say perhaps Judas Iscariot, who was in charge of the money bag, or something like that. Well, when we turn over to John chapter 6, this is the feeding of the 5,000 miracle, and we look at verse 5, we read, lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so this people may eat? Now, this raises an interesting question in the mind of the audience. Why Philip? Why does Jesus speak to Philip here in particular as to where to send people to buy bread? Philip is a fairly minor character in the Gospels. Furthermore, in verses 8 and 9, we learned that one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many? Again, another interesting question. Why does Andrew get involved in the reply? Why does Andrew speak here? Well, turning over 6 chapters later to a completely unrelated text in John, this is 6 chapters later, concerning a different Passover feast. And it mentions that there were some Greeks who were at the Feast of Passover. They wanted to speak to Jesus, so they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, sir, we wish to see Jesus. And notice the parenthetical statement or allusion to the fact that Philip is from the town of Bethsaida in Galilee. Now, if we turn over to Luke's account in chapter 9, verses 10 and 11, this is the parallel account of the feeding of the 5,000 miracle. And it says, on the return, the apostles told him all they had done, and he took them and withdrew apart to a town called BETHSAIDA. And that's where the feeding of the 5,000 takes place. Now, notice also that in John chapter 1, verse 44, it also mentions that BETHSAIDA is the city of Andrew, who, if you recall from John 6, gets involved in the reply. So putting the pieces together then, Luke doesn't mention Philip or Andrew in this context at all. And John doesn't mention BETHSAIDA as a setting of the miracle. Only by putting these texts together can we understand why Jesus speaks to Philip in John 6:5, or why Andrew gets involved in the reply. Philip and Andrew are local to the town of BETHSAIDA, and so they know where the shops are to buy bread. But that's never spelled out explicitly for the reader. One has to do the detective work of putting the pieces together from those disparate texts found in John 6, in John 12, in Luke 9, and now we have a complete explanation for why Jesus speaks to Philip in John 6:5, and also plausibly why Andrew is involved in the reply as well. So this is an example of an undesigned coincidence. But wait, there's more. There's also an account of this miracle in Mark chapter 6. Now, according to Mark 6 in verse 31, it says, and he said to them, come away by ourselves to a desolate place and rest a while, for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And so there's this allusion to the busyness of the place, the hustle and bustle. It's so busy, in fact, that they can't find leisure to eat their lunch. So Jesus has them come away to a deserted area to eat. But unfortunately for them, the crowds follow them. And it says in verse 39 that Jesus commanded the crowds to sit down in groups on the green grass. Now, about that green grass, the grass in Israel is actually not green. It's brown throughout the majority of the year, except a relatively narrow window of time around the spring because of the higher levels of rainfall. Now, when you look at, and that coincides with the time of Passover, the Jewish feast. Now, when you over to John's account, John, in his account of the feeding of the 5,000, does not mention how busy it was, that they didn't find leisure to eat their lunch. It also doesn't mention the green grass. But John, in chapter 6 and verse 4, does tell us that the Jewish Passover festival was near, which then very casually illuminates why it's so busy, because there were why there were the coming and going crowds, because it was the Jewish feast of Passover, these Jewish pilgrims coming in for the feast of Passover. And it also illuminates why the grass is green, because it's the right time of year. And so these sorts of undesigned coincidences, where you have a natural question raised by one account that's explained and clarified and illuminated by another in a casual and artless and undesigned way, is more probable or more expected on the hypothesis that we're dealing with historical reportage when we read the Gospels, rather than the contrary hypothesis that what we're reading is historical fiction. Now, what is the significance of this type of evidence? Well, one undesigned coincidence might be an accident, like having two unrelated pieces of a jigsaw puzzle fit together just by chance. But if we discover numerous undesigned coincidences crisscrossing the documents, it becomes ridiculous to insist that they're all just accidental. Here's another one also relating to the feeding of the 5,000. So in Matthew 11, verse 21, Jesus pronounces woes on the unrepentant city, saying, woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented a long time ago in sackcloth and ashes. Now, what mighty works, though? Nothing Matthew has reported up to this point gives us any clue. Well, if we go over to Luke's account in chapter 9 and verse 10, we read that the event of the feeding of the 5,000 actually took place in Bethsaida. Now, although Matthew 14 narrates the feeding of the 5,000, no mention is made of Bethsaida in that context. And moreover, Matthew, who often arranges his material thematically rather than chronologically, tells the story of the feeding of the 5,000 3 chapters after this pronouncement of woe to Bethsaida. So only by comparing Luke's account do we discover that the feeding actually took place before Jesus pronounced the woes over Bethsaida. And so there's another example of an undesigned coincidence. Another coincidence relating to the feeding of the 5,000 is, how did they know the number of people? Why do they know that it was 5,000? Well, in Matthew 14:21, it tells us specifically that the 5,000 actually refers to men besides women and children. The statement that about 5,000 men were fed also occurs in Mark 6 and Luke 9 and John 6. Although these Gospels don't add besides women and children. The feeding of the 5,000, by the way, is the only miracle besides the resurrection that's found in all 4 Gospels. Matthew's account of the feeding of the 5,000 then emphasizes that the number refers specifically to males. But how is this number calculated? Well, in Mark 6, 39 to 40, we read that Jesus commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. Also, Luke says, he said to his disciples, have them sit down in groups of about 50 each. And they did so and had them all sit down. So no doubt having the crowd sorted into groups like this made it easier to distribute food to them. And it also made it possible to get some idea of how many there were. Now, in John 6, we have another interesting piece of information, because John makes no mention of the groupings, but his account adds a crucial piece of the puzzle. So Jesus tells the disciples to have the people sit down in groups, just as Mark and Luke say, but according to John, it's the men who actually sit down. So look at John 6, verse 10 and 11. Jesus said, have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. So this explains how the number of men could be approximately counted. And presumably the women and children were doing their own thing, perhaps playing in the surrounding area. So again, providing an artless or casual interlocking between the accounts concerning the feeding of the 5,000 in a way that tends to confirm the historicity of the narrative. Here is another example. This concerns the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. So in John chapter 12, we read, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. And Jesus has dinner with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus that night in Bethany. And then, according to verse 12, the next morning, he enters Jerusalem on the back of the donkey. So if Jesus enters Jerusalem 6 days before Passover, if he enters Bethany 6 days before Passover and enters Jerusalem the next day, that would make his entry into Jerusalem 5 days before Passover. Now, that's actually a detail that's specific to John. All 4 Gospels mention the triumphal entry, but only John mentions that the entrance into Jerusalem was specifically 5 days before Passover, and he'd actually arrived in Bethany the night before. Now, I would argue that we can actually find those 5 days in Mark's Gospel, even though Mark does not give us the timestamp that John gives us. So in Mark 11, verses 1 and 2, we read the parallel account. It says, when they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage and Bethany, at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, go into the village in front of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find a colt tied on which no one has ever sat. Untie it and bring it. And so Mark actually telescopes the account relative to John. He condenses the narrative. He doesn't mention that Jesus had actually arrived in Bethany the night before, and it wasn't until the morning that he sent the disciples to fetch the colt. But when we look at verse 11, it mentions that he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple, and when he looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. Now, if we assume, for the sake of argument, that John is actually correct, John was the only gospel that told us that Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem was 5 days before Passover. Let's just grant, for the sake of argument, that that is correct. This would make this detail in Mark correspond to the evening 5 days before Passover. Notice it says it was already late, so he goes out to Bethany with the 12, so he's on his way home for the evening after his entrance into Jerusalem. This is the evening then, 5 days before Passover. Now, if we turn over to the next verse, in verse 12, it says, on the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. So this would be the morning, supposing John to be correct, 4 days before Passover. And then verse 19 says, when evening came, they went out of the city. This would be the evening 4 days before Passover, supposing John to be correct. Then verse 20 says, as they passed by in the morning. they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. This would be the morning, 3 days before Passover. And then you have the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus has a conversation with his disciples concerning the signs of the end of the age on the Mount of Olives, which is midway between Jerusalem, where he's been all day, and Bethany, where his accommodation is for the night. And so we can assume reasonably, I think, that he's on his way home to his accommodation in Bethany, and this is the evening, 3 days before Passover. Now, when you turn over to chapter 14, verse 1, it says, it was now 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so it correlates or corresponds exactly as you would expect, given the chronology and the timestamps supplied to us by John, but does so in such a casual and artless way that actually supports the historicity of both Mark and John on this very, very specific and extraneous detail that Jesus enters into Jerusalem as 5 days before Passover, and then Mark seems to count off the days in a way that artlessly dovetails with the chronology of John. Here's another example. So in John 13, this is where Jesus is washing the disciples' feet. It says, Jesus laid aside his outer garments and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet. Now, this one might well ask, well, why does Jesus wash the disciples' feet? Well, we read in Luke 22:24 that a dispute also arose among the disciples as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. So only Luke mentions that dispute that arose among the disciples that explains why Jesus gave them this object lesson in servanthood. And in fact, if you look at Luke 22, what does Jesus say to the disciples as they argue about who's the greatest? He says that who is the greatest, the one who reclines at table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table, but I am among you as the one who serves? And then the Gospel of John, which records the foot washing episode where Jesus washed the disciples' feet as a display of his servanthood, then makes sense of and illuminates Jesus' statement in Luke's gospel. And also Luke provides us with the context, the occasion that gives rise to Jesus' object lesson in servanthood. John reports the object lesson itself, namely washing the disciples' feet, without reporting the occasion that gave rise to it. So this is another example of an undesigned coincidence that corroborates both Luke and John. Here's another example. So in Mark 14:58, we read that the false witnesses at Jesus' trial before Caiaphas step forward and they bear false testimony against Jesus, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that's made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. In Mark 15:29, when Jesus is on the cross, the passersby are mocking him, and they say, and they're wagging their heads, and they say, aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Now, nothing in the Synoptic Gospels, so this episode occurs in both Matthew and Mark, nothing in those Gospels provides a pretext for this accusation. The reader's just left hanging. I mean, this is a fairly serious allegation that we're talking about here. In the context of first century Judea, this is not the sort of thing that you make jokes about, destroying the Jewish temple. And notice it says that Jesus purportedly said that he would destroy the temple that's made with hands, and in 3 days he'll build another not made with hands. Now, that doesn't seem to be something that the false accusers have come up with out of whole cloth, but rather is more like a garbled version of something Jesus in fact said. Now, when you go over to John chapter 2, verses 18 and 19, it tells us that the Jews said to Jesus, what sign do you show us for doing these things? And Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. So John actually gives us the original statement of Jesus, but not his use as an accusation. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Mark in this case, give us the later accusation, the misrepresentation, the twisting of Jesus' words, but not the use as an accusation, but not the original statement. So neither of those appears to be copied from the other. So notice that Jesus never said anything about destroying a man-made temple and rebuilding it 3 days, but not by human hands. That's a twisted version of what Jesus in fact said. But John gives us the pretext, not the later accusation. The Synoptics give us the accusation, but not the original statement. Again, an undesigned coincidence between John and the Synoptic Gospels. Another example concerning the naming of the disciples. So in Mark 3, verse 17, it mentions that to James and his brother John, the sons of Zebedee, Jesus gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder. And this is a very incidental allusion, and it's unexplained in Mark. There's no further explanation or elaboration as to why Jesus gives the sons of Zebedee this designation, this nickname, the sons of thunder. Now, when we go over to Luke's account, chapter 9, verses 51 through 55, we get a little window of insight into the personality of James and John that might illuminate why Jesus gives them this designation of sons of thunder. It says, now when the days drew near for Jesus to be taken up, Jesus set out resolutely to go to Jerusalem. He sent messengers on ahead of him. As they went along, they entered a Samaritan village to make things ready in advance for him. But the villagers refused to welcome him because he was determined to go to Jerusalem. Now, when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to call fire to come down from heaven and consume them? But Jesus turned and rebuked them, and they went on to another village. So it's any wonder then that Jesus gave the sons of Zebedee this nickname of sons of thunder, or Boanerges. And so, but Luke doesn't mention that the sons of Zebedee were given this nickname, and that's only found in Mark. And so the accounts illuminate and clarify one another. Also relating to the disciples, in Matthew 10, we have a listing of the 12 disciples. We read that the names of the 12 apostles are these. And notice that the 12 disciples are grouped into pairs. It says, first Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Now, why does Matthew group them into pairs like this? Well, the explanation is actually found in Mark's Gospel in chapter 6 and verse 7, which tells us that Jesus called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. So here we learn that actually Jesus had sent out the disciples 2 by 2, which illuminates why in Matthew the disciples are grouped into pairs. Now, although Mark 3 does tell us, does list for us the 12 disciples, Mark does not group them into pairs like we find in Matthew. And although Matthew mentions the sending out of the 12, it doesn't mention they were sent out in pairs 2 by 2. And so the two accounts again clarify and illuminate each other in a very casual and undesigned and artless way that points to truth. Another example is in Matthew 14, verses 1 and 2. This concerns Herod's conversation with his servants. It says, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants. This phrase, to his servants, is actually unique to Matthew, even though Mark also tells us about this episode. Matthew adds this expression, to his servants. This is John the Baptist. He's been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. Now, this raises two interesting questions in the mind of the audience. Number one, why is Herod talking about this matter to his servants? And number two, why would Matthew know what Herod has said to his servants, presumably in the privacy of his own palace behind closed doors? Well, we turn over to Luke's account, which is not the parallel of Herod talking to his servants, but we learn about certain women who followed Jesus from Galilee. And it says, soon afterward, Jesus went on through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him. And also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, and Susanna, and many others, who provided for them out of their means. And so notice that Joanna, one of Jesus' female disciples, is actually married to someone in the highest ranks of Herod's employment, namely his household manager, which then illuminates how the author of Matthew's gospel could come to know what Herod was saying to his servants in the privacy of his own palace, and also illuminates why Herod might be talking to his servants about Jesus in the first place. Again, an undesigned coincidence that tends to confirm the historicity of both Matthew and Luke. Here's one that concerns Jesus' trial before Pontius Pilate, the Roman procurator. In John 18, we read that they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters, so they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death, This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken, to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Okay, so the question that arises from this text is, where did Pilate get the idea of Jesus being the king of the Jews from? Well, we go over to Luke's account, the parallel of this text, in Luke 23, verses 1 through 5, and we read that the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he said, "You have said so," and so forth. And then he continues, then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But they were urgent, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea from Galilee even to this place." So we learn then that Jesus had the accusation that was brought to Pontius Pilate by the Jewish leaders was that he was allegedly forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Now, this also raises another interesting question, which we find in verse 4. So after Pilate asks Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus says, "You have said so," which probably means you said, or it's an answer in the affirmative. And then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." So Jesus just pled guilty to the charge of calling himself king of the Jews. And then Pilate promptly declares him to be innocent. How does that work? Well, we learn in John's account in chapter 13, where it tells us that Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not from the world." And so Jesus tells Pilate that he is the king of a kingdom, but this kingdom that he's ruler of is not of this world. He's talking about a spirit, and Pilate then understands that Jesus is talking about a spiritual religious kingdom, and presumably dismisses him as some harmless religious nutcase that can be safely ignored. And so then that illuminates why in Luke's account, even though Jesus has just declared himself guilty of the charge of claiming to be king of the Jews, Pilate then promptly finds him to be innocent, because he's not talking about a physical earthly kingdom, but rather a spiritual or religious kingdom. Here's another instance from that concerns, also involves Pontius Pilate, and this is when Joseph of Arimathea comes to Pilate to request the body of Jesus. It tells us in Mark 15, when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Now, notice the expression that Joseph of Arimathea took courage and went to Pilate. Now, why does Mark choose to emphasize the courageousness of Joseph of Arimathea in particular? Well, if we look at John 19, the parallel account, John doesn't emphasize the courageousness of Joseph of Arimathea, but he does mention, after these things, Joseph of Arimathea was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. So he was a secret Christian because he was afraid of the Jews. And Mark, presumably knowing this, chooses to emphasize Joseph of Arimathea's courageousness in going to Pilate to ask for the body, potentially blowing his cover as a believer in Jesus, a follower of this crucified Messiah. Sometimes you can find undesigned coincidences within a single source, and this is an example of that. And this can happen when the appearance of casualness or artlessness is sufficiently strong. So in John 18, verse 10, we read that Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. Now, John is the only gospel to tell us the name of the high priest's servant. It adds the servant's name was Malchus. Now, John is the only gospel author, as I mentioned, to tell us the name of the high priest's servant. Now, how does John uniquely know the servant's name? Well, if we continue reading in this chapter, we read this is when Peter is being interrogated by various individuals by the fire. It says, one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. Notice that this individual who questions Peter is one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off. And so again, John is in the know as to who this individual is. He's the only gospel that gives us this information, that this person who inquired of Peter was a relative of Malchus. So how do, again, we can ask, how does John know this when no other gospel tells us this information, the name of the high priest servant being Malchus, and that this individual who inquires of Peter was a relative of Malchus? Now, in verses 15 and 16 of John 18, we read that Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. Peter stood outside at the door, and then Peter gets in later. But notice that this other disciple, who also follows Jesus from a distance along with Peter, is someone who is known to the high priest. Now, who is this other disciple who'd been following along with Peter from a distance? Well, in John 20, verse 2, it says that she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." So Peter went out with the other disciple, and they were going toward the tomb. So this other disciple again shows up as clearly someone who was a close companion of Peter, and is often seen together with him. And furthermore, in John 19:26, when Jesus is on the cross, we read, Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby. He said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Of course, Peter is gone by this point after his betrayal of Jesus. And this other disciple, who had also followed at a distance, is described or identified by the phrase, "the disciple whom Jesus loved." And so the beloved disciple who shows up throughout John's gospel turns out to be the individual, the other disciple, who had followed along with Peter towards the cross, and actually was still present as Jesus was being crucified. And of course, Jesus entrusts the care of his mother Mary to this beloved disciple. Now, who is this other disciple, this disciple whom Jesus loved? Well, in chapter 21, at the conclusion of John's gospel, in verse 24, we read that this is a disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true, referring to the beloved disciple. And so actually the author of John's gospel is purportedly the beloved disciple. And this is actually corroborated by this undesigned coincidence internal to John, where because this explains how the author came to know the name of the high priest's servant, because this is an individual who had insider knowledge. He actually was known to the high priest. And so he's in a position to know the name of the high priest's servant being Malchus. He's in a position to know that the one who inquired of Peter is someone who is a relative of the one whose ear Peter had cut off. Also relating to Jesus' prayer at Gethsemane, here's another example of an undesigned coincidence. So Simon Peter, it says, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Now, the expression, "shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me," appears in no other Gospel's account of this event. The Gospel of John never anywhere else portrays Jesus as using the metaphor of the cup to describe his crucifixion. So why does he use this metaphor here? Well, the synoptics tell us that Jesus prayed that night in these very terms, asking that the Father would take from him the necessity of suffering crucifixion, referring to it as the cup. "Let this cup pass from me," Jesus says. And so when Judas and the soldiers came to arrest Jesus, evidently Jesus accepted this as the Father's decision to give him the cup. And so that hand in glove fit, or this undesigned coincidence, actually supports the veracity of this saying. Another example concerning John the Baptist's testimony concerning Jesus. So in John 1, verse 15, we read that John testified concerning Jesus. He cried out saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me." And Luke 1:36 tells us that even Elizabeth, your relative, is going to have a child in her old age, and she who was said to be unable to conceive is in her 6th month. So once one reads Luke 1:36, one understands or comes to recognize that John the Baptist has been indirectly referring to the fact in John 1:15 that Jesus was, in fact, biologically younger than he was. That is, his words only take on theological meaning or significance when one comes to understand that John would have known that Jesus was not really before him biologically. And John the Baptist would have given them theological significance only if John the Evangelist knew that Jesus was biologically younger than John the Baptist. Otherwise, this aside that we find in the prologue of John's Gospel is unexplained. But it's well explained once we know that Jesus was actually younger than John the Baptist, which is implied by this text that we read in John 1, verse 36. Now, the 19th century lawyer Edmund Bennett says that forgers do not rest content with such roundabout confirmations. So again, we have this undesigned coincidence between John and Luke. Okay. Another instance, this is actually an example post-resurrection of Jesus, where it says that when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Now, this raises an interesting question in the mind of the attentive reader. Why does Jesus ask Peter whether he loves him more than the other disciples do? Well, the explanation is supplied in Matthew 26:33, which says, "Peter answered him, 'Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away.'" But that saying is never found in John's Gospel. Matthew records, though John does not, Peter's boast that he was the most faithful of Jesus' disciples. And so then illuminates Jesus' question in John, "Do you truly love me more than these?" So in summary then, cumulatively, the numerous undesigned coincidences between the 4 Gospels suggest that the Gospel authors are close up to the facts, well-informed, and habitually scrupulous. And we've only been able, of course, to touch the peak of the iceberg this evening, but we will be covering more in the ensuing weeks. So for further reading on this, here's 4 books I would recommend. I recommend Lydia McGrew's 3 books, Hidden in Plain View, The Mirror or the Mask, or The Eye of the Beholder. She's coming out with a 4th book in the not too distant future, which is called Testimonies to the Truth. And I also recommend this book by Peter J. Williams, Can We Trust the Gospels, for further discussion of this line of evidence, as well as others as well.